As a member of the Appointments and Promotions Committee here at Boston University School of Public Health,
Look at him name dropping.
we
Prestige
Shall
dropping.
I cross your palm with silver bond? What's your price?
Welcome again to Free Associations from the Boston University School of Public Health, the Public Health and Medical Journal Club podcast for anyone who is as confused by the latest health study as I am watching a Fellini film. You guys fans?
Oh my God, totally confusing.
I've never.
Science is so much easier than
I've
Fellini.
always wanted
I
to
love
understand
Fellini.
one,
I love
but
Fellini.
I can't get them at all. Anyway, I'm Matt Fox, professor of epidemiology and global health, and I am here with Don Thea and Chris Gill from the Department of Global Health.
Hello.
And we are here in the Boston University Godley studio. So guys, I've got something amazing to tell you guys about this week.
Really?
You want to know what it is?
I do.
I want to be amazed.
It is the Population Health Exchange.
Oh, seriously?
Yeah, you're going to love this.
I've been reading about that.
Yeah, so this is the Boston University School of Public Health's resource hub. Resource hub for lifelong learning.
That's like Boston.
Oh, yeah. Do you know why Boston is called the hub?
Because it is?
Most of us don't know. And
I do know, but I forgot.
Oliver Wendell Holmes referred to Boston, specifically not Boston, but the capital, the State House, as the hub of the universe.
Oh, that's right.
And that is where it came from.
Why would he say that?
Because it was at the time.
Because we are I'm not going to say anything. Anyway, did I mention the Population Health Exchange at all?
No,
It's
but
a hub for lifelong learning.
I heard about this
Yeah,
on a
what'd
website.
you hear?
It was on the populationhealthexchange.org website.
PopulationHealthExchange.org website. And you know what else you can find at that website?
All sorts of information about lifelong learning, man.
Including this podcast.
Yeah. And all over 20 episodes now.
23 or 4. This is 24.
This will be number 24, which is like 11. We're coming up to year one, aren't we? Have we passed year one?
We have not passed year one
We're coming up on year one.
So another reminder, if you could go ahead and give us a rating on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, whatever it is that you use to get your podcast. So now let's move on to the show.
Okay.
So today, in our first segment, which is the Journal Club segment, we are going to talk about a study that tested the effectiveness of synbiotics, closely related to probiotics, but not the same, to prevent sepsis in neonates. In the second part of the podcast, which is our deep dive, we're going to talk about whether scientific productivity has changed over time or whether it's actually stayed the same. And then in our third segment, which is our amazing and amusing, we are going to get into some of the things that have us giggling or just amazed. And from there, we'll just see if I can get through it. So let's get into segment one. Segment one, we're going to get into this article that looked at the effectiveness of synbiotics for prevention of sepsis in rural India. The study was published in the prestigious journal Nature with first author Pinaki Pinagra of the Department of Epidemiology in the Center for Global Health and Development at the College of Public Health at the University of Nebraska Medical Center. Did I get that all right?
I think you did.
And the study was done in 2017, so this was one that Dawn found and thought it would be good to look at. So it's not a brand new study, but it was entitled A Randomized Synbiotic Trial to Prevent Sepsis Among Infants in Rural India. So let me give you some headlines on this one from 2017. So the New York Times said, how to prevent deadly infection in babies? Good bacteria. National Public Radio said probiotic bacteria could protect newborns from deadly infection. Business Insider Singapore says a new kind of probiotic could change the $38 billion market by relying on real science. And Cameron Diaz?
Cameron Diaz, the actress?
Yeah.
Huh?
I'm not. I didn't fully read the title clearly before I put that one in there.
Get back to us on that, Matt.
The Scientist magazine says seeding the gut microbiome prevents sepsis in infants. So Don, give it to us without grunting.
Okay.
Can you give it to us? What happened
All right.
here?
A little bit of background. Neonatal sepsis is really important. It's not very common, but it's deadly. When kids get it, it's got about a 60% case fatality rate.
Can I just ask you, what is sepsis before you...
Sepsis is bacteria in the blood.
Bacteria in the blood.
Right.
Causing an inflammatory reaction leading to
Shock.
multi-system organ failure and death.
Right.
Okay.
So I think it's important to say that over the course of the last 30 years, we've made incredible strides in decreasing child mortality globally, but more so in the older children than in the young ones. And the young ones are harder to treat. They're harder to identify. It's harder to know when a child is septic or has a serious bacterial infection, and they're harder to to treat. When they do, they tend to get more nasty organisms also. So what this study attempted to do was to try to see if, in fact, you could prevent the development of sepsis in these very young kids using this synbiotic. And a symbiotic is really a combination of the probiotic, which is a benign bacterial organism, along with an oligosaccharide. And their reasoning was that if you put the oligosaccharide, which is a sugar that the bacterial organism eats to sustain itself, but which we cannot. And in fact, there are a whole bunch of oligosaccharides like the one that they put in these particular pills that exist in breast milk. And part of the benefit of breast milk is to really alter in a beneficial way the microbiome of a child who has a developing immune system. So their reasoning was, I think, fairly understandable.
Wait, hang on. Is it though? Because why do we think this would prevent sepsis specifically?
Because sepsis in children develops when the organisms in the gut cross the gut, they call it translocation, and get into the blood and then circulate in the blood. And they're obviously not supposed to be in the blood. And that's a sort of the cascade of difficulty that they have. And when a baby is born, they're depending on how they're born. And there's some evidence to suggest that a baby that is born vaginally as opposed through C-section, they're colonized with better bacteria.
Okay.
And that may have an effect.
And so we're trying to prevent the takeover of the gut by harmful bacteria that could then get into the blood.
By crowding out the harmful bacteria with these good bacteria. So there have been a number of other studies that have looked at this, but they've not been good because there were imprecise outcome measures, there were no blood cultures, and they were small. So these authors mounted a community-based, double-blind, individually randomized trial in 149 Indian villages where they gave this symbiotic orally for 7 days, starting on day 2 through 4 of life. The follow-up was daily at home. The inclusion criteria were children who were over 2,000 grams of essentially normal birth weight and where breastfeeding had begun within 24 hours. The exclusion criteria, however, were extensive, and there were a whole bunch of exclusion criteria, such as gestational age being less than 35 weeks, low birth weight, not able to tolerate oral feeds, the infant didn't cry immediately after birth, mothers had fever, or there was suspected sepsis at the time where the infant was on antibiotics. So there were a lot of conditions for which children were not entered into the study, which I think we'll come back to, but I think is significant.
Because these are all things that are kind of markers of kids who are pretty sick already.
Or risk factors for the development of sepsis.
Or may even have sepsis.
Correct. So they screened 7,000 children. They enrolled 4,556, and they followed them for 60 days. Community health workers identified 704 kids with probable serious bacterial infection who were sent to the health facility where an evaluation was done by a pediatrician to establish that, in fact, this PSBI, probable serious bacterial infection, was in fact confirmed. Only 3% and 14%, respectively, of the children who were referred were in the first 2 weeks of life, and we'll come back to that because I think that that's important. The bulk of the kids who developed the outcome were in the 3rd and 4th week of life. And of the 319 episodes of PSBI, which were established by the pediatricians using fairly strict WHO criteria, were all treated with IV antibiotics for 5 days. 189 were not admitted to the hospital, but given oral antibiotics and treated as outpatients. They did blood cultures on 182 out of 319. They didn't do it for children who presented with what appeared to be lower respiratory tract infection. The outcome was a combination outcome of sepsis and death.
And sepsis was defined in a very particular way, as I recall this.
Yeah. It was positive blood culture.
Yeah, they had 3 tiers. There was like confirmed sepsis, which they had a blood culture that grew something.
Right.
And then they had suspected sepsis, where they suspect, the blood culture didn't grow anything. And then the third one was lower respiratory tract infection, where they didn't even try to do a blood culture.
Right, which technically is not necessarily sepsis.
Right.
So what did they find? They found a 40% reduction in the combined outcome, which is a large reduction in either sepsis or death. But the caveat is just what Chris said, was that the definition of sepsis is a little bit not a terribly hard outcome.
And 40% down from what? The question I always want to know is, is this a 40% reduction off of a common outcome or a rare outcome?
9% in placebo and 5.4%
So
in
it's
the
meaningful when you're talking about something so severe.
Right. So culture positive and culture negative sepsis both decreased, and the relative risk, the reduction, was about 80% in kids who had had a positive blood culture. There was also a 34% reduction in lower respiratory tract infection, and they also noted that local infections, skin infections and other middle ear infections, also were reduced as a result of this intervention. There were no appreciable adverse events. There was 4% loss to follow-up. There was a little bit of imbalance at the beginning, but they did some sensitivity analyses, which we've discussed before, and there was no effect. And the trial was terminated early. Because
they found a benefit, because they found such a strong benefit.
Right,
Yep.
and they determined that the cost of this particular intervention would be about $1 per course, and that the number needed to treat one serious probable serious bacterial infection would be about $27. 27 cases would needed to be treated in order to avert one real serious infection. So that's where we are.
So in essence, a large trial, 4,500 kids, double-blind, randomized trial. With a placebo on a really serious infection. It sounds like, and good baseline balance in terms of randomization. Sounds like good news. Chris, what's your take?
Mm-hmm. Well, all three of us have spent a lot of our careers trying to figure out sort of low-cost, effective ways of reducing childhood mortality, including neonatal mortality. And, this study didn't actually find an effect on death, so let's be very clear about that. When you break down their endpoints, they had 4 deaths in the control arm and 6 deaths in the symbiotic. So they had, in fact, no impact on mortality.
And we would have expected 112 deaths among neonates in this particular population, based on published information on neonatal death rates.
Yeah.
So it's kind of surprising, actually, that the mortality rate is so low.
Well, I think that in part is explained by all those exclusion criteria that I talked about before.
So I guess my basic take is that we are all philosophically aligned on our deep desire to find effective low-cost interventions that would significantly reduce mortality in very poor country settings like this part of rural India, which apparently, according to the authors, has the highest rate of neonatal mortality in all of India. So I would love this to be true, but I have to say I'm very skeptical.
You have some skepticism?
I have some skepticism.
Why?
I'm not quite sure I buy it, and I had trouble really putting my finger on it as I was reading it, except for the fact that it just felt like it was too, I know this sounds trite, but it was almost too good to be true. Let me go into that, because...
can I just ask, does that make you doubt the finding, or do you think it just means you think the finding is exaggerated?
It's a heavy lift, is I guess what I'm saying. Carl Sagan used to say, and I don't think he was the first one to say it, but like extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof, which, by the way, is kind of an encapsulation of Bayes' theorem. Right? Mm-hmm. That if you start with a very low pretest probability of something being true, you need tremendous evidence to flip that over into the very likely to be true. So I would start at my baseline pretest probability that adding in one species of bacteria to the microbiome, the complex microbiome of an infant, would reduce sepsis by 50%. I would have predicted that the probability of that being true was really small. Yeah. Because to me it feels like firing a pea shooter at the Titanic. Right, the gut has got thousands and thousands of organisms. That, like, why would adding Lactobacillus, species X, change that in such a radical? Even in a neonate, why would it change that so profoundly? So I find that the scientific premise behind it to be difficult to explain. And then on top of that, we have a history of studies of probiotics which have not shown benefit in terms of reducing mortality. The one exception where I think the evidence is somewhat persuasive is that for extremely premature infants who often suffer this terrible condition called necrotizing enterocolitis, which is believed to be caused by bacteria attacking the intestinal wall and causing perforations and sepsis. That for that small, for that subset of premature infants, that probiotics do have, seem to have a protective effect. But in those same studies, they have not found that premature infants are protected against neonatal sepsis. And so this study is really an outlier in terms of finding this, this very profound effect in a group that is outside of the traditional high-risk groups where sepsis is concentrated. And so that feels, it raises some flags for me in terms of like, why would this work when so many other studies have foundered? Then I start to see, so once I start with my skepticism, I start to think about the data and like, what does it say in terms of the expected patterns we see in this population? And you already raised the one, which is where are these sepsis deaths occurring? So if you look at review articles of neonatal sepsis, the distribution of neonatal sepsis events occurs predominantly in the first week of life. So 50% of all neonatal sepsis is between days 0 and 7, and then 25% and 25% are in weeks 2 and 3 respectively, and then the rest is over the next 6 months, basically.
And these were all excluded.
These children were systematically excluded, for one thing, because they removed them during days 0 and 2. But then the sepsis events that did occur were in exactly the opposite pattern from what the epidemiology suggests, where they found that 3% of their sepsis events were in weeks 1 and 14% were in weeks 2 and 3, which is exactly the opposite of what you would anticipate to see. And then the neonatal mortality rate, as Don said, is this is great, but astonishingly low. We had what?
It's one-tenth of what we would expect.
10 deaths out of 4,500 infants.
Instead of 112.
In Zambia, we expect 40 per thousand in the first month.
Yeah, it's 25 per thousand in this population.
So we would have, so 25 per thousand. So we would have expected 100 deaths, right. 150 deaths in this population. Where are they? Why not? Why 10 instead of 150?
And what's your supposition?
So it makes me feel that somehow the population was selected in a way that introduced some bias here.
No, I wouldn't say bias there. If it has to do with the way the population was selected, it gets to generalizability.
Well, maybe that's a better way of saying it, generalizability. So it doesn't seem like a representative sample that describes the typical neonatal sepsis cohort.
Yeah, and that could be because of the exclusion criteria, as Don says. That could be because these kids were getting such good care,
right?
Exceptional care, different from what they would get as standard of care normally.
Somebody was coming by every day for 60 days and affirming that they were either well or not well.
Yeah.
So that's not normal.
So another thing that kind of caught my attention that sort of gets to the plausibility of this result is the kinds of endpoints or the differences in the endpoints that they saw. Specifically, there was this striking reduction in lower respiratory tract infection, which is basically what we would call pneumonia. How would changing the intestinal microbiome significantly affect pneumonia rates? I suppose it could, but it seems unlikely because it's the wrong organ system. So this is lower tract. The lactobacillus species is going to mainly affect bacteria that live in the small intestine and the large intestine, and less have of an effect on the upper intestinal tract, and really almost no impact on the upper respiratory tract. So how do you have a reduction in pneumonia? That seems odd. And stranger still was this reduction in this condition called omphalitis, OMPHALITIS, which my wife also calls awfulitis, which is an infection of the umbilical stump where the cord was cut. And those were reduced by almost 80%. And I can think of no possible way that ingesting lactobacillus, well, I'd like to hear it, but I couldn't think of any way that you can get from lactobacillus in the intestine to changing the skin flora of the umbilical cord. I don't see that leap, and yet that was the most profound effect of all in this study. It was reduction in omphalitis.
Although it was a much rarer outcome. So.
Indeed, but still, it struck me as odd. Same thing with skin abscesses, which I don't see the link between
Don, what do you got?
Gut infections and this.
Yeah, I mean, if you're inducing a substitution of the possibly pathogenic organisms in the intestines with a beneficial organism, and a child's pooping, and it's not necessarily something that is very totally clean and located, it's to me perfectly conceivable that there could be some contamination of the umbilical stump while the child is defecating, or while the diaper is being changed, or something like that. So it's a possibility.
It's a possibility, but I take your point that I could see there's some pathway that might lead to that, but it doesn't seem, this is not what I would have expected as the most likely impact of taking an oral preparation of probiotics.
I think omphallitis is oftentimes infection is due to gram-negative bacteria. So
And also staph.
And or staph, right? Yeah. But and a lot of times it's it's sort of those gram-negative growing organisms.
So efficient to say that for all of these reasons, I came away feeling like I would love this to be true, and yet my sense of skepticism was pretty high. And at that point, I start to look for the trial appears to have been done well and cleanly and rigorously, but what would be the kinds of mistakes that might occur in the conduct of well-intentioned mistakes? I'm not talking about any kind of intentional manipulation of the data, but what are the kinds of things that go wrong in randomized controlled trials that could possibly lead to bias in the outcomes? And the one that struck me the most is this issue of blinding. And of course, we're not talking about blinding the infants who are, they don't need to be blinded. What I'm talking about is whether the people who are assessing the health status of the infants, these health workers who came by every single day to observe the children's health, whether there was some way that they could have figured out who got the lactobacillus versus the placebo capsule concoction. And in the methods, they say, the two of them were indistinguishable by, visually and by taste. And yet, when we did that stent trial, one of the things we loved about that trial is that they canvassed the doctors and the patients to see, could they tell who got what, and they couldn't tell. Whereas here, I would really like to know, the placebos were basically maltodextrin, which is a very, very, very sweet sugar. Compared with this lactobacillus mixed with these oligofructose. So in fact, if we were given 2 glasses of this, would they taste equally sweet? Would they look identical? Would they have the same smell? That is all just claimed that it was perfectly, equal. And yet if it was not, that's where you could get some ascertainment bias or some observer bias creeping into this.
But you're presupposing that the mother would be tasting it, not the child necessarily. Because
I'm talking about the observers who were preparing these preparations for the mom each day.
But I believe that was
they only
prepared
did the
centrally.
First day. Yeah, I think I don't know about the preparation, but it was administered by the observer the first day, and then after that by the
But
mother,
all they need to know is figure it out once.
Yeah.
All they would need to do is figure it out once, and then you have the tendency to find more events in the control than in the
I think we should say that's obviously complete speculation. We have no idea.
Absolutely.
But I will say I shared some of your skepticism, maybe not to the same degree, but what I wrote down here in my notes was, this is a big, well-conducted trial, and yet I want to see another one. I'd like to see some confirmation of this. And I think one of the things that, in addition to the things that you mentioned, is this was a trial that was stopped early. And one of the things that we know about trials that stopped early is, on average, they tend to overestimate effect sizes. It could be that just the size of the effect was large by chance, and that these 2 curves would have come back together. There still probably would have been a benefit, but that the benefit is overstated due to the fact that the trial was stopped early.
Right. There was also a little bit of differential loss to follow-up. I don't know if you noticed that.
I didn't.
So there were 76 dropouts in the control group and 112 in the case group, in the intervention group. So not a startling difference, but enough when you're talking about a relatively rare outcome like sepsis. Could that have hidden some events?
Yeah. Well, so I mean, Don, you want the last word? Do you share the skepticism that Chris and I have? I should say I'm skeptical. I don't mean to imply that I don't think it's a real effect. I mean, this is, from what I can tell, a large, well-conducted trial. So I'm not trying to say that I believe there's anything sort of glaringly wrong, and yet at the same time, I'd want to see another one before I really believe the size of the effect.
Yeah, I feel the same with that. Both you and Chris feel that I really would like the study to be accurate. I'd really like to find some sort of silver bullet like this. I mean, it's really if true, would be a very important finding. And I'm not sure how they could do it better other than by including some of the children who were excluded, because that's really the majority of the burden. Because if you have probable serious bacterial infection, which is a soft finding, even though the WHO has developed an algorithm, it's the best that we have, it's still a soft finding. The really important issue here is death. And if you have transient, possible, serious bacterial infection and it goes away on its own, then it oftentimes leaves no long-term damage. And so it's almost kind of, well, does it really matter that much? So I think really to have a major impact on global health, this study really should be repeated, and they should exclude almost none of the kids to see if, in fact, I mean, it's. I can understand why they did it, and it's conceivable that it's hard to conceive that this particular intervention would have any effect whatsoever on an incipient bacterial case of bacterial sepsis.
You mean once it's already started?
Once it's already started, it's hard to imagine how this could actually work. And the rationale for it being a prophylaxis against the development of, I think, makes a lot of sense. But nonetheless, I think it would be important to include it. And they might come up with exactly the same findings, but
so
with all these kids excluded.
Sounds like we're all completely agreed that this is a provocative finding, and we'd love to see it replicated before we're willing to say we
Put it
buy
into
it.
policy,
And I'd like to see with a mortality outcome.
Yep, I agree.
All right, well, let's move on then to our second segment. And in our second segment, this is an article that Chris found that we found interesting enough that we wanted to talk about it. And the question is, over the, let's say, past decades, there appears to be a proliferation of journals, which makes theoretically, if there are more journals, there's more opportunities for people to be publishing. Articles that you might have once upon a time not been able to get published, there now is probably a journal out there that will accept it. And the question is, has that led to people publishing more and more papers? Or has that led to, and not necessarily in a good way? In other words, have people been dividing up their work into smaller chunks to get more publications out of it?
Slicing.
What they referred to in this article as salami slicing. So the article itself was an article in PLOS One. It was entitled "Researchers' Individual Publication Rates Has Not Increased in a Century," which there are some journals won't allow you to put the finding in the title. This obviously is one that will. And it was written by Danielle Fanelli and Vincent Lariviere. And Chris, this was one that piqued your attention, so I'm gonna hand it over to you to give us a little bit more detail as to what they did.
Mm-hmm. I'm always astonished when you hear some very famous person coming in to give a seminar, and they get up and say, Dr. So-and-so from the University of blah, 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 who did his training here and there and has all these awards and has published 799 papers to date, and it is only 39. I'm like, and I feel like I'm shrinking into my seat, feeling inadequate. Mm-hmm. It's like, how does anyone publish 799 articles?
Chris, your 7 papers are great.
That's right. I'm feeling very humble. And so, you see these extraordinary statistics and wonder how mere mortals could ever possibly get there. And this is kind of what they're getting at, is that if you look over time at the average number of papers published by researchers over the first 15 years of their research careers, you'll see that there is a linear increase in publications over time. Across all different disciplines, physical sciences, social sciences, medical sciences,
and
whatever.
How do we know that?
They did this analysis of 45,000 researchers who were identified through the Web of Science, and then they followed their first publication and then tracked them forward to see how many papers they published. Cumulatively, yeah.
Over 15 years.
Over a 15-year period. So looking at that, basically the early investigator era.
The rate per year?
The total number of papers, published by authors over time. So they could see that each year...
it would always go up, if you're productive.
But it's the rate. It's the rate per year,
okay.
Not the cumulative number.
At the end of 15 years, what's the total?
Okay.
Yeah. And so what it seems is that over time, researchers are publishing on average more and more papers per year than...
Per birth cohort,
Per birth cohort, right. Exactly.
Per researcher.
Or an individual researcher
cohort,
adjusted forward, like, in their year 1991, they're publishing averages 2.3, and in their year 1997, they're publishing on average, 10.2 papers. But sort of marching that forward and adjusting for when they started, you see that there seems to be a hyper-productivity of each successive generation of researchers. But at the same time, there's a linear increase in the number of co-authors on every paper.
Yep.
And so you start to wonder if this is just a big game of everybody citing everybody else on everybody else's paper.
And what was
not citing,
including them on the author list.
Co-authors.
As co-authors, yeah.
And what was the period of time? What years was this?
Starting in around 1990 and I think going to 2013.
No. So the data set they originally had goes from 1900.
Oh, sorry, way back.
But they mainly focused on 1980 through the present.
80?
80.
Yeah.
Because that's when they felt like they were, it was a reasonable period of time to observe this increase.
And, of course, they had an extraordinary size data set to work with. I actually jotted this down because I was kind of struck by it. So they had 41,000 authors, each followed for the first 15 years of their careers, sort of corresponding to the early, investigator stage of every researcher. This led to 1.2 million papers by a total of 534,000 authors. And so the average number of papers had gone from around like 0 to 1, circa 1900.
0 to 1 per
year. To between 2 and 7 and basically around 5 per year now. But the corresponding number of co-authors on the articles had also ballooned. So what they did is they adjusted for the number of co-authors on the paper and really sort of lasered down to focus on the first author position. First, second, and final are the most important papers in medical journals. Positions. The first, second are the most important places on an authorship list in medical publications. But for this, they just focused on the first, because the first author is generally considered to be the one who led the analysis and wrote the paper. So it's like the guy who actually wrote the paper is the first author. Yep. And everyone else contributed in various ways to varying degrees. But the one you most care about is like the most, the keyboard time invested in writing a paper is that first author's plot. And when you adjust for all the presence of co-authors, like being included as a list of 42 authors on a paper, when you cut that down and just look at the first authors, the actual productivity of researchers has not increased whatsoever.
That we're just as productive as
we ever were,
but we get more publications.
But we get more publications
because we're sharing the authorship
with many people, and it's a reciprocal relationship.
We're padding our CVs, is what you're saying.
In a way, that's basically what it's saying, and that in fact we are just kind of treading water in terms of our ability to ourselves sit down and think of smart things to say and write.
So, Don, the obvious question to you is, why are you padding your CV? I mean, what's your reaction to this? I mean, is this a bad thing necessarily?
I'm not sure that I really believe it. For one thing, I mean, I believe the numbers. I believe what you're saying, but I do. But I do think that the context has changed. I think that science has become more complex. Science has become more collaborative. A lot of projects are done with in a multi-center fashion. With, like, for instance, my experience on an ammonia study, which involved 7 different sites and an executive committee, and there was a tremendous amount of intellectual input put into all of the design of this and implementation of the study, as well as the analysis. And there are many papers being written from that one effort. Now, there are senior authors that are in part responsible for getting the grant. And coming up with the conception. And a lot of times in situations like that, the first authors are the ones who write the first draft, but they tend to be sort of the younger members of the team, because I think that there's this conception among a lot of us that what we want to do is we want to enhance the career of some of our younger colleagues. So I think that there's that dynamic going on, and I think that one has to take that into consideration. And being somebody who was involved in science and was publishing papers back in 1990 and the late 1980s, I can, from personal experience, say that science has become much bigger, much more collaborative, and many more sites. So I don't think that it's I think the circumstances have changed over time.
Yeah, and in defense of your position, that's pretty much what they say too. They're not stating that this is a negative thing, that people are padding their resumes by being on the sort of corporate authorship list. What they're saying is that there's a prevailing belief that a lot of this sort of ballooning volumes of publications on your CV is because we're salami slicing or writing kind of trivial puff pieces or repeating our analyses in multiple contexts, basically saying the same salami slicing, right? The smallest publishable unit is the size of the paper. It's what they're going for. They actually are not saying that that's the case at all. They think that the paradigm of science has changed in the way that you're describing, and that there is a legitimate growth in the number of publications because of this sort of collaborative large team structure. And that's fine. What I think they're more interested in is how do we address the question of like these sort of superhuman researchers who publish 700 papers plus, where you think like, God, do they ever sleep? How does any mere mortal do that? Yeah. They're saying actually they don't. So that's the first answer. Nobody does that. The number of first authors by these sort of mega superstars, with the possible exception of John Ioannidis, who apparently does write all of millions of papers, is most of us are in fact mere mortals. But that the driving force behind this is the change in the scientific culture, and.
Yeah, I mean, I think I come down somewhere in between the two of you. I mean, you're right. I agree with you, Don, that science has changed and it's become more collaborative. But at the same time, these large projects that people pool together from lots of sites tend to produce lots and lots of data, and therefore there are therefore theoretically more opportunities to get more first authored publications out of them, and yet the number of first authored publications has stayed the same. So to me, that suggests that while there is more data, there is a little bit more of getting your name onto something just because of a role that you played that wasn't necessarily leading anything. Now that isn't necessarily a bad thing, as you point out, and it isn't necessarily CV padding, but at the same time, I would have expected both should be happening. Mm-hmm. That you should have more papers in total, but you should also have more first authored papers because you have more opportunities than you used to.
I think that if you were to include corresponding and senior authorship in that particular analysis, I think that you would find that it would increase.
Maybe, except that remember, they intentionally looked only at the first 15 years of publication, specifically because they wanted to focus on a period of time when people were junior, they had more impetus to publish, but they probably would have been less often in the senior author.
That's a good point.
But I think there's also a tendency for researchers when they get a grant to try and maximize the output as much as possible. So rather than get a grant for one study and write one paper about that one study, it's a natural inclination on all our parts to try to maximize it and to write other papers. And in that instance, even if it's within the second half of your first 15 years, if you got the grant, you're either going to be first author or you're going to give it to somebody else and you're going to be senior author on that. So I think you really, I guess I take issue with the implication of what first author actually means. I think that it's fluid. I don't think that the first author necessarily always means that this is the person that put the majority of the effort, intellectual effort, into that particular.
So, Chris, last word to you, Chris.
Well, I was going to say, what do you think it means then to be first author in the new era?
I think that the first author is, in my experience, is the person who obviously has been very involved in the study, but is the person who is responsible for writing the first draft of the paper, and then it's a collaborative effort. Not always, sometimes the first author takes on, does soup to nuts in these instances.
Yeah.
Well, last word then. I think we need to be circumspect and humble in interpreting productivity metrics like the citation index or the H index or just the number of papers you put out as a really valid measure of your productivity. I think you won based on this article. You could make the argument that if you put out 2 or 3 first author papers a year and nothing else, you are actually on par largely with people who have 15 or 20 articles published a year where they are first author on 2. That you have to be careful about how you're counting, what the denominator is that you're counting, because it does make a difference.
Let me just say one other thing. As a member of the Appointments and Promotions Committee here at Boston University School of Public Health,
look at him name dropping.
We
prestige
dropping.
Shall
I cross your palm with silver bond? What's your price?
The point being that we do take into consideration second and senior authorship almost as much as first authorship.
Yeah. Okay.
Good to know.
All right. Well, we're going to move on. We are going to move to our amazing and amusing segment where we want to highlight some of the things that make us really enjoy our jobs. Don's waving his arm. Apparently that means he wants to go first.
Yeah.
All right, Don, take it away.
So I've got a paper that relates very specifically to the first segment of this podcast where we talked about the symbiotic effect, preventative effect.
Synbiotics.
Synbiotics.
Yep.
And this is a paper by Raquel Rubio, Ana Joffrey, Belen Martin, and Margarita Garriga in Food Microbiology. And I'm not going to talk about the paper. I'm simply going to read the title.
Food microbiology.
Food Microbiology.
Okay, hold on. Let me brace myself.
This was published in 2014. The title is Characterization of Lactic Acid Bacteria Isolated from Infant Feces as Potential Probiotic Starter Cultures for Fermented Sausages.
Say what?
Wow.
Whoa.
Wow. Wow.
Food Microbiology.
That's a real thing?
That is.
Here you go.
Sausage. First of all, what's a fermented sausage? So many questions here. What's a fermented sausage?
I don't know. I didn't read the article.
Nor do you need to. It all just really reminds us we don't want to know how they make the sausages. We don't want to know how they make the sausages.
All right. In that case,
Wait a second.
That's facially.
Chris, over to you. No, you.
That's terrible.
You're done.
Lactobacilli strains were evaluated for their ability to grow in vitro in the processing conditions of fermented sausages and for their functional and safety properties, including antagonistic activity against foodborne pathogens.
Really?
Fermented. Is this like kombucha sausages? I have only ever had
Kimchi sausages.
I have only ever had kombucha once, and as they say in Johnny Dangerously, I had fermented kombucha once. Chris, what do you got?
So I have been reminded on a number of occasions by my wife and our former chair.
Pick up your socks.
There are many things that she reminds me to do. One of them is that she reminds me that I'm very obvious in revealing my emotions in public spaces. Like when I'm annoyed about something, you could really tell. Mm-hmm. John Simon used to say this too. Like when we would have a seminar on Tuesdays, and some guy would come in and like start spouting out a nonsense, and I would turn bright red and start scratching my head, and he'd like give me a big elbow and say, "Stop that!
Yep.
You know, we know you hate it, but shut up." You know, and I was like, "I didn't say anything," and he's like, "Yeah, but everyone can tell." So this article, when it came across my desk, just smiled to me, and it is called "Facial Color is an Efficient Mechanism to Visually Transmit Emotion" by Carlos F. Benitez Quiroz and his esteemed colleagues Srinivasan and Martinez in the Proceedings of the National Academies of Sciences. And they wanted to ask the question, are there, in addition to facial expressions which clearly transmit emotion non-verbally, are there changes in blood flow to different parts of the face and the ears and the forehead that connote different emotions?
Like blushing?
Like blushing as opposed to turning bright red in anger. So or having your ears turn pink when you're embarrassed. So there are like different patterns of where you pink up in different circumstances related to emotions. So they were wondering whether there are distinct, facial coloration changes that occur linked to emotion. And the answer is absolutely yes.
Really?
And that you can very clearly identify patterns that are like anger versus surprise versus happiness versus embarrassment based just on color patterns, and that these can be distinguished from the facial pattern, the facial movements that often accompany those same emotions. So controlling for movement of eyebrows and squinting your eyes and scowling and making little pouty faces with your lips. If you get rid of all of those, you can still tell a lot. And that if you just show a series of images of individuals with different color patterns on their faces to individuals who are then asked to rate what was the emotion, they do extremely well in spotting what the emotion was that was linked to those. Yeah, so I was thinking it's really kind of interesting. And it is relatively
Chris
insensitive.
Does not play poker.
This is why I don't play poker. This is my tell. I'm like telling you, oh, I've got 4 aces. Boo, face turns bright red, eyebrows go up. I'm like, yes. Everyone says I fold. James Bond, not. Casino Royale. They didn't ask me to audition for that part.
No, they didn't.
They did not.
Well, that's pretty cool.
So it was pretty cool. And it is relatively insensitive to facial pigment. So it's a true across all races. So I really liked that.
Cool. Yeah. Very cool.
Very, very cool.
All right. Well, mine is from, let's see. Mine is from Science Mag. This is an article by a gentleman named Dalmeet Singh Chawla entitled Great Paper, swipe right on the new Tinder for preprints app. No. So these guys at Hopkins have put together an app in which you can rate the paper
Scientific validity.
using the same Tinder swipes that you would to rate a person.
Saved me a lot of time on peer reviews. I'll
So
tell
it
you
says
that.
if you're tired of it really would. I hadn't thought of that. If you're tired of swiping left and right to approve or reject the faces of other people, try something else. Rating scientific papers. Paper, PAPR, brands itself as the Tinder for preprints. Paper co-creator Jeff Leake, a biostatistician at the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health in Baltimore, Maryland, released an earlier version late yesterday. The goal is to help researchers navigate the overwhelming number of new papers and uncover interdisciplinary overlap. So you've got this paper, and I couldn't actually download it. I could only find the.
So wait. I don't understand.
So people put their preprints of their paper up. It gets picked up by this service that then you can look at it and you can read the abstract and then say, you can then swipe.
Why do that?
So that you can let other people know what find interesting, what they find interesting. You can bring that information together so that you're then bringing the more relevant information forward to people in the morass of the overwhelming number of scientific papers. Morass is not the right word. Overwhelming number of scientific papers that are out there, and you can get the good stuff to you.
So presumably, you would all the papers that you swipe right on, if you and I have similar interests, would be.
Surprisingly, I don't use Tinder, so I don't know what swipe right is the good one or the bad one.
Nor do I.
Well, I think it's remarkable that none of us actually use Tinder, and yet the lexicon of swipe right, swipe left is totally penetrated the population.
But Don and I don't know which one it is, whereas you appeared to know exactly when you were doing your swipe left, swipe left.
Just have to
But
read.
left is always bad and right is always good. So I'm just assuming left is the discard pile and right is the accept
they have
pile.
T-shirts on this now.
Okay. So you can.
So there's a way for me to follow the papers that you're interested in.
Yeah. So you would swipe right for exciting and probable. You would swipe up for exciting and questionable. You would swipe down for boring and probable, and swipe left for boring and questionable. Which I thought it was pretty interesting idea. I'm not going to use it, but.
Wow.
It is out there in case you want to.
Wow. And does this then help the journals steer papers to you that are more relevant?
Well, it's preprints. I don't know. I think it would steer more articles towards you that you're going to like.
I see. So it's a way of disseminating the information to the right readers.
I think so.
Cool.
Somebody's going to figure out how to monetize this.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah,
So that is the end of our program. If you've got any feedback on this or any other episodes, or you want to suggest a study, or you want to just request that Chris stop drinking beverages with ice in them during the show, you can let us know.
Who does that?
And the way to do that would be to tweet us at PopHealthyX, or at me at ProfMattFox, or at Chris at ID.Gill, or at Don.
Or swipe us left.
At DTheo1. Or you can find us on the Population Health Exchange website at www.pophealthex.org. We want to thank Leslie Talalian, Director of Lifelong Learning at BU School of Public Health, for supporting the podcast, and Nick Guler for the days and days of editing that he does on each and every episode to make it sound good. Thank you for joining us. We hope you enjoyed it, and we hope you will download our next episode.